Right, everyone, it seems that my clock says 9:45, which is the official starting time of this session. And this is the session on learning and games. My name is Harko Verhagen. I'm at Stockholm University and I'm chairing this session. We have 3 papers today that will be presented in this session. The general structure is 10 minutes presentation, 10 minutes of question time following that, and questions are taken via the chat. And I think that's all for the rules for now. And in case you have any general questions, just post them in the chat as well. And then we keep the channel clean for the presentations. So we start with the first presentation. It's on self-determination theory in HCI games research, current users and open questions. And we have 2 authors, tyack and Elisa D. Mekler. And I see Elisa is there, so I'm hoping that Elisa is the one doing the presentation. There you go.
Hey, I'm tyack, and I'm going to present self-determination theory in HCI games research, current uses and open questions. Paper I wrote with Elisa Mekler when I was at QUT, and now I am at Aalto University. So, I guess we'll start by asking why do we care about theory? What does theory do for us in research? Certainly HCI researchers have used a lot of psychological theories quite commonly in the field's history, I guess. And research on games and play is no different. We use theories all the time, like flow theory, social cognitive theory, and self-determination theory. Obviously, the third one is the one I'm going to talk about today. But what theory does for us, I guess, is potentially anything. That's maybe overstating it, but theory can inform practically any stage of the research, from planning to writing up, research direction, hypotheses, methods, and reasoning about the world. Helps us understand both how things work and what has already been done and said. Self-determination theory, which is, again, the subject of this work, is quite commonly used. It's macro theory of human motivation, growth, and well-being. It's too big for me to summarize in this 10-minute talk. It comprises 6 mini-theories, and it's heavily cited, particularly for the games-related work that's been done, which has over 3,000 citations in some. But knowing that it's heavily cited, we wanted to know how HCI games research actually applies it, and what we've learned as a result of applying it, with a view to kind of figure out where we could go from here. So we did the systematic review of all the Chi and Chi-Play papers that have mentioned SDT and games. Clearly there's been a big uptick in work since 2014, and you can see some of that is due to Chi-Play existing, but there's been a steady increase at Chi as well. I think it's weird that it took so long. I'm not sure why that is, but someone who's been around longer than me can probably help answer that question. Those papers that I had on the previous slide were published, in 2006 and 2010, so it's not like it was like kind of novel work at the time, I guess. So, what we found, first, the theory is used in a wide range of subject domains. Some of the more unusual, perhaps, examples, so just evaluating VR control scheme, in game-based advertising, and AI development. Frankly, I was surprised at the different places that the theory has been used and the ways that it's been used. However, most applications of the theory are surface level, only tangentially relevant to the work, or in rare cases, actually at odds with the theory. Some examples, I guess, defining autonomy in terms of independence, which actually frequently happens outside games research as well, and indeed the kind of main SDT authors have written at least once about what autonomy is and why it's not independent or control. Secondly, I guess as a second example, we saw people conflating external regulation, which is a form of extrinsic motivation that focuses on responses to rewards. Found people conflating it with extrinsic motivation as a whole. And if I had time to explain the theory, I could have put the big diagram with all the different forms of extrinsic motivation on it, but I don't. So suffice it to say that there are some good forms of extrinsic motivation that have nothing to do with external rewards. I guess this is important primarily because misapplying the theory or like tangentially applying it doesn't really do much for you, and in fact can cause harm in scare quotes where we end up with research following up on it maybe that also has the same kind of mistaken assumptions about the work or about SDT generally. Saw a lot of use of the IMI and the pens, and quite often to stand in as a kind of generalized player experience when evaluating an artifact or a video game or some other game elements or whatever. Player experience is kind of this something that can be assessed by just picking a bunch of subscales, basically, in a lot of cases. And I think it would be important to kind of question what we consider. This is a matter for another time, perhaps, but I think it's important to kind of reconsider what we consider player experience and maybe do some more specific terminology generation in that area. I think it reflects a kind of a common theme, I guess, in not only these results, but player experience research generally. Now I'm generalizing. So, secondly, I guess SDT propositions were sometimes used to justify research, like validly to do these things, to explain results or produce design implications, which is great. But saw fewer papers really engage with SDT beyond this kind of pragmatic, once-off kind of, and this finding might have occurred because result from self-determination theory. I guess it's also worth noting that only 2 papers proposed theoretical extensions or modifications. So even as we're applying SDT and using the results that have already kind of been shown in other places, we're not really developing or extending or challenging the theory ourselves. So it's really a kind of pragmatic application of it. I guess so what does this review tell us about where we could go with self-determination theory, I wonder? Well, there are dozens of propositions, concepts, and even entire mini-theories that are yet to be mined for content, capital C. For example, one of the 2 generative papers that we found in our review is Data Ding's paper about contextual autonomy and satisfaction, I think is the term, maybe not. But he proposes a model that's kind of interesting and has yet to see real kind of validation or further testing or any kind of elaboration from other people. So there's plenty of opportunities to do that kind of work. And I think more generally, it's important to emphasize that more consistent engagement with theory, self-determination theory or otherwise, will improve our study designs and explanatory capacity. If we can have reasons for doing things that are grounded in a consistent kind of theory or a mix of, like a combination of theories, helps us kind of move forward as a field even, or as a discipline or whatever. I think there's big opportunities to use theory, and the prior results from HCI research that uses SDT to progress more generally. And that's particularly true because we keep using the same scales, and there's room to kind of build from that. Anyway, that's all I have time for. But once again, I'm April Tyack. I'm here for questions now, or email me if you want. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. We now have opportunities to ask questions. They will be posted in the chat. And from there, I will pick up the ones that I think are the most interesting ones. So you're at my mercy. And to prepare for that, so you can get some time to think about, I would pose my first question to the authors and see how they think about that. And in the meantime, everyone else can think about questions themselves. So both in the paper and the presentation, it is stated that only few, and there was an exact number, 2 studies extend the theory that is being chosen for the analysis, the SDT theory. And that without any context is quite difficult to analyze. Is 2% high or low compared to other areas of research in HCI research that use theories, and taking into account that the Chi Play workshop and conference has a relatively short history? What do the authors think about that?
Yeah, great question. I can only, go off my memory of other systematic reviews, but I do think the rate of theoretical, or generative research is often maybe not super high, but I think it's higher than what we have in the way SDT is used in games work. I am thinking of the Clemenson et al. Paper on activity theory, and maybe the I don't know. None of the other ones come to mind at the moment, but I think the rate is somewhat higher. But I mean, I think for the span of time that it's been used, for only 2 papers to ever have done anything with the theory itself is kind of notable. Even just looking at it from that perspective, even if you consider only from 2014 onwards, there's a lot of papers published. There's a lot of room to do this kind of work. And I think also the fact that we don't see these kinds of papers followed up on, in that last slide, Dieterding's model of contextual autonomy or whatever, is yet untested, I guess. It seems like we're kind of not super interested in doing that kind of things with the theory at all. Does that answer your question?
It is a answer, and it is the one that we're getting. I'm still looking for questions in the chat. It seems to be quite quiet. And with that, maybe I just turn to a second question that I prepared. It's a question you address yourself in the paper. It has to do with the selection. I mean, if this is a systematic review, I think I need a stronger argument of the exclusion of other venues than the Chi conference and the Chi Play. I mean, game research is going on much more outside of Kai than inside of Kai. So why this? I need an argument.
We were specifically interested in it's a specific community, and I guess there's patterns in Kai and Kai play research that you wouldn't necessarily find if you included, or they wouldn't be as strong, or we'd have too much to talk about for a 10-pager. So at the moment, we're in the kind of initial stages of a follow-up where we do look at other venues, and I guess preliminarily, those venues have very different practices in the ways that they use SDT. And I think the themes of this paper wouldn't come out nearly as clearly if we had looked at other venues. And certainly at the time, we had some impression that there was a certain mode of how SDT was used at these venues specifically that we wanted to investigate further, I guess.
Okay, so there might be an opening for some new extension of your current system that they can review to make it more encompassing. I would highly recommend that. I think there's someone who says there is a question, or is that the maybe pointing towards the chat to put the questions there? I'm not sure. Aske, are you wanting to ask a question, or are you posing?
I wanted to ask a question.
Sorry?
Yeah, my idea was to ask a question. If that's all right.
Please.
All right. No, so you talked about how different communities use SDT differently, and how wrong practices can have consequences. Do you have any sense of outside of academia in the more applied game production, how SDT is used, if used at all?
Right. Yeah, great question. Anecdotally, from talking to developers who have heard of the SDT before, and certainly in GDC talks, SDT is kind of used in similar ways, actually, as HCI Games research uses it. It's mostly kind of a tool for playtesting. Certainly the pens gets used, and there was recently kind of updated need satisfaction scale that's mentioned in the paper, the UPEC, I think, the Ubisoft Perceived Experience Questionnaire, that looks somewhat similar to the pens in some ways. So it's kind of like this, I don't know that they necessarily have the library access to more deeply engage with the theory. So it really does get used as a kind of, there's some kind of surface level theory, but it's mostly just about basic psychological needs and motivation. Everyone focuses on intrinsic motivation because it's linked to enjoyment, and it's mostly just a way to think about your results in playtesting. Does that help? Cheers.
Thanks a lot. And with that, we conclude the presentation and question part of this presentation, and we have half a minute until the next presentation starts. Thanks a lot. And preparing for the next presentation. The next presentation is investigate the rich interpretation of text and audio in educational VR using learning outcomes and EEG. The authors are Aske, Mottelson, Sarune, Baceviciute, and Terkildsen and Guido Makransky. And the video presentation is made by Sarune, and the pushing the buttons of the video will be Aske, if I'm well informed. And Aske, you can start.
That's right. So Sarune is actually the first author of this paper, but she's in LA, so I'm handling the presentation. I'll just share my screen here. All right. Can you all see it?
We are using learning outcomes in EEG. I'm here on behalf of myself and my colleagues, Aske Mottelson, Terkildsen, and Guido Makransky. Altogether, we come from the University of Copenhagen in the Virtual Learning Lab. And at our lab, we do a lot of really cool and interesting things, all investigating learning in virtual reality. This study is specifically embedded in my PhD project, where I've been looking into how can we use knowledge from human cognition and psychology to design effective virtual reality applications for learning. So this study was motivated by surveying the existing virtual reality education tools and tools that students have available in the market today. And what we can see is that most educational virtual reality systems are heavily based on read-mediated written and spoken representation formats that are very customary to traditional 2D media and have been just ported into this immersive space in virtual reality, as you can see from this beautiful picture here. So there's a sort of a hidden expectation or implied expectation that these representation formats might be just as effective in immersive media as they are in two-dimensional media. However, we know very, very little about how do we actually cognize and make sense of these representation formats in this new immersive space. So with this motivation, this study was focused on investigating three main research questions. So the first one is reading or listening superior for learning in virtual reality. The second one, are embedded interfaces more superior for learning in virtual reality? And the third, are there any differences in cognitive processing when learning from different representations in VR? So there are different theoretical foundations that we used for designing our experiment. I don't have that much time to go in depth with all of them. However, just to give you an overview, the first school of thought that we looked at was the cognitivist kind of approach, in particular the cognitive load theory, the dual coding theory, or the modality principle, that say that presenting some information in the visual mode and other information in the auditory mode can reduce cognitive load and expand effective working memory capacity. We also looked into more the perceptual domain, for example, the Colavita visual dominance effect that states that the phenomenon wherein visual stimulus, whenever shown at the same time with auditory or other stimuli, have a tendency to dominate consciousness. We also explore more new and novel approaches in cognition and cognitive studies, such as embodied cognition and embodied learning, where the assumptions would be that the contextual embeddedness, bodily cues, and physical interactions can affect higher level cognitive processing, like learning and metacognition. So our study at the end consisted of three different conditions: the overlay condition, the virtual book condition, and the auditory condition. So in the overlay condition, the idea was that students learned from this overlay modal interface that was static to the environment with text represented on it. In the virtual book condition, the students learn by reading text presented in a more embedded, contextually embedded format. A virtual book was exactly the same representation of text as in the overlay condition. However, this time it was only mapped on a different object in the virtual world that was actually embedded in the virtual world. They were able to rotate the book around, but the representation of text and the way that they interacted with it didn't change at all. Same with the auditory condition. It was exactly the same text that the students listened to there. However, this time the text was not written, but it was spoken by a voice actor and pre-recorded prior to the experience. The playback was the same. Nothing in the environment, characters, the participant's position in the space or anything like that didn't change throughout the experience. So it is only the format of representing information that changed. So we developed a specialized virtual VR application for this in Unity and optimized it for the HTC Vive system. So the task was to read or to listen to these 25 different snippets presented in these different representation formats. Each snippet had a unique information point that students had to learn on the topic of sarcoma cancer. Sarcoma cancer was chosen due to its novelty for the general population. And there were 78 university students that participated in the study in between subject design. As you can see, these are examples from how the procedure looked out in our lab. The experiment was seated, so students didn't have to move around, and they interacted with the content only by pressing a button on the HTC Vive controller, which the only thing that the button did was allow them to move through the sequence of pre-recorded and predefined sequence of these snippets that they were learning from, and they were not able to go back. So there were different measures that we used for evaluating efficacy of these different representations. And for the learning outcomes, we investigated retention, transfer, and self-efficacy. And the retention measure, we investigated how well did the students retain information from the different snippets. In the transfer measure, we evaluated how much they could synthesize all the knowledge presented to them and apply it to a novel learning context. In self-efficacy, they were asked to rate how confident do they feel with their learning. For the second set of measures were cognitive load measures. Here we evaluated mental effort, concentration, intrinsic load, meaning how difficult did they perceive the content to be, extraneous load, meaning how difficult did they perceive the format the content was represented to be in. And these were all Likert scales. Then we had a visual attention measure that evaluated how much extraneous attention did the participants pay to the objects and the environment surrounding it. And finally, we had an EEG, our EEG measures, where we focused on the EEG frequency domain, especially in the theta and alpha frequency bands. So the results. So for learning outcomes, we saw a significant difference in retention, but not in transfer. A significant difference was between the audio on the book condition and the audio on the overlay condition, which basically suggested that when information was displayed in an auditory format, the participants were able to form an overall understanding, but could not remember the details implicit in the learning content. We saw a significant difference in the self-efficacy measure, where students perceived the book condition to be significantly higher than the audio condition, and there was almost a significant difference between the book and the overlay. For cognitive load measures, we saw significant differences in intrinsic and extrinsic cognitive load. In intrinsic cognitive load, the content was perceived to be the most difficult in the auditory condition and the least difficult in the book condition. For extrinsic cognitive load, the format of representation was perceived to be the least difficult in the book condition and the most difficult in the overlay condition. For visual attention, in the auditory condition, students paid the most attention to the extraneous environment and remembered most details from the environment. Theta activity was lowest in the audio condition, and low theta activity in the auditory modality might indicate lack of memory retrieval and sensory integration. And since we know that auditory information is more transient, this might suggest that there is an impede of passing of information from short-term memory to long-term memory. From the alpha results, we saw high alphas in the audio condition and lowest alphas in the book condition. So high alpha activity in the spoken condition might indicate lower levels of sustained attention and cognitive effort. And since they also retained less in the auditory condition, low alphas might indicate overall lower levels of engagement when learning. Low alpha activities in the book condition, on the other hand, indicate higher mental activity, which might suggest that engagement on motoric action might stimulate cognitive processing. So our conclusions, very quickly. From learning efficacy, if we had to summarize which representation is the best, we saw that embedded text outperformed both of the conditions, and auditory representation formats were performing the worst in terms of learning efficacy. So we ended up our paper with presenting some design recommendations for using text and audio in educational VR. These are important factual information should be presented as text, not audio. Text should be contextually presented in the environment. Learning information could be presented in audio if attention to the environment is required or if memory workloads should be minimized. Learning information could be presented in audio if remembering facts is not the goal of virtual reality. Another important kind of conclusion that we wanted to draw from this paper is suggested by the superiority of embedded representation formats, which suggests that learner's body, the space, and the learning context might have significant implications for learning in virtual reality, which says that we should try to use the affordances of virtual reality as much as possible when we're designing educational content for learning in VR. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Here's our contact information if you guys want to contact us and ask any questions. Unfortunately, I probably will not be able to make the presentation today, but I hope that Aske will be able to answer all your questions. If not, just drop me an email, or otherwise just drop me an email, and that's great. Bye.
Good. Thanks a lot for the presentation. And we open the chat for questions. And as in the previous paper's case, I will drop the first question to break the silence. There was a difference between the reading and the listening condition, whether it's embedded or not embedded. What I can't find in the paper, but I may have read too fast, and I didn't hear it in the presentation, but I may have listened too little, was the test done in the mother tongue of the students or not? We all know that foreign language processing while reading is much easier than when listening. That goes for all the tests that we see. And if it's not in the mother tongue, that might have been an intervenient variable.
It was done in the mother tongue. It was done in Danish, but obviously it's been translated to English for the paper.
Okay, I think that would have been good to have included in the paper, because for me that would have explained some of the cognitive load. And a related question about revisiting the information that is presented to the students. You said something about there was no option to step back, but usually when we read a text, we can read it a few times, well, as the listening probably cannot re-listen. Was that the case, or was that a similar condition anyway?
Yeah, so obviously we had to decide when designing the interfaces whether we would make the textual interface as a regular text interface would be. In the case of the book, you would be able to go to the next page or the previous page, but we decided on not allowing that because it would give an unfair advantage to the book compared to the auditory information that would be a playback recording. Thus, participants wouldn't be able to rewind. So both the overlay condition and the book interface only allowed to step forward, and thus they couldn't go backwards.
Okay, but they could still read the text a few times while at the same step, but maybe not listen a few times. Yeah,
exactly, and that might explain why remembering facts on text was higher.
Thank you.
That's true.
I have a question in the chat, and I will give the. So Darius, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Perfect. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, Aske. I'm
Hi.
Darius from DTU. So I'm curious whether you know if the participants during the audio were closing their eyes to better focus on the audiobook, because I know from past experience that actually the alpha frequency increases just by closing your eyes. So do you have any comments on that part? Or
so they were instructed to stay still and not close eyes, but I mean obviously with EEG data there's a lot of room for noise and artifacts. So I think we're also cautious about making too strong conclusions based on the EEG data in the paper. They are meant mostly as showing some sort of explanation for the results rather than conclude, say, and audio interface leads to higher mental load, because it's kind of hard to do that from this sort of data.
as well as now with the VR, they're probably moving their head as well, right? And
Yeah, and for some of them, they were first users of VR, and obviously that puts a great mental toll on the experience. That being said, it's a fairly high amount of participants compared to that EEG data was collected on all of them, and given the quite obvious significant differences between the conditions, I would expect that that per participant variance didn't matter too much, because we see for the electrodes that almost all of them have significant differences across conditions between textual and auditory representations. So in that sense, even when being modest about concluding anything from EEG data, I think there's some pretty clear indications.
Yeah, thanks. Point.
Thanks. I see two persons announcing that they have a question. I think I explained in the start of the session that you have to write the question so we actually can select questions. That makes life a bit easier for us as the moderators. So please post your questions there. In the meantime, I have a very short question while waiting for those written questions in the chat. The testing was done quite closely to the learning experience. Which makes for one set of testing recall, but not maybe for the best one. Do you think there will be a difference in the conditions if you would test like 1 week afterwards, and maybe then the VR experience would have a better result?
I think that's likely. Obviously, retention would be different from doing it 5 minutes after the experience than a week or a month later. And I think definitely further studies should go in and study the prolonged effects. I think still it's interesting to see that there's this high significant difference between retentions just after the experience based on whether it was text or audio. But it's definitely a possibility that these effects will be different on a more prolonged basis.
Okay, and I see the two questions. I think both are quite relevant. So we give 1 minute to each of the questions. The first will be to Demosthenes, and the second one will to Nitin. Demosthenes. You can unmute and ask the question with use of your voice. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the talk, Aske. I had a question on the differences. If you can tell us a little bit on the interaction differences. For example, did users spend more time across different modalities of communication? So, for instance, I can imagine that the audio there's of course a passive. They're more passive with the audio modality, as of course it is spoken out to them, so the time is very set. While having a book, a virtual book, that you can go back and forth and read the information again, which would also change how this information is captured. So were there any time differences? That's one part of the question. And then how do you compensate for that, getting EEG data in different windows?
So there weren't any timing differences, but obviously there were interaction differences between the different conditions. One of the conditions gave you a book that was mapped to the movement of your controller. Thus, the interaction was obviously different from just listening to the explanation. Exactly because of the timing different issues. And the EEG collection, we forced people to have similar windows also in the textual condition, to be able to compare conditions on that basis. But obviously the VR interaction would be a bit different. I think it's hard to conclude exactly what that sort of interaction leads to. On whether it's the interaction itself or it's the contextualness, but obviously we see a difference just based on the representation of for instance, having text as an overlay or having a text mapped as a book.
Thank you. I think time is running out to pose the final question, so I suggest that Nitin poses this question directly to the authors, and that we turn to the final paper of this session, which is the paper. I have to look at my screen, Collaborative Technologies for Children with Special Needs, another systematic literature review, being presented here by Gokce, Elif, Baykal, Maarten van Mechelen, and Eva Eriksson. The floor is to the authors.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the introduction. I'll be sharing my screen. So I hope you're seeing my screen well now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this talk. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to present and introduce our work to the CHI Nordic community. I'm Gokce Baykal. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Aarhus University, working in child-computer interaction field, a subfield of HCI. And today I'll be talking about our literature review, which I worked with my co-authors, Maarten van Mechelen and Eva Eriksson. And this work is part of the Collaborative Information Technologies in Special Education project funded by Aarhus University Research Foundation. So in this presentation, I will briefly summarize what we have presented in our paper, which showed the state of the art in the field and overview about the types of collaborative technologies, with a particular focus on children with special needs. The demographics of the target groups of children in different developmental conditions and needs, the theoretical groundings and the methodological approaches that have been used so far to develop the collaborative interactions in these technologies, and define a future research agenda on this topic. So collaboration is one of the 21st century skills and has been taken central attention in research, theoretical and technological developments, especially in education, psychology and design research. However, children with special needs may need some support in developing their collaborative skills. And in this work, we refer to the term children with special needs, relying on UNESCO's definition, which refer to children who are up to 18 years old, who require some additional support to participate in society and have some difficulties in meeting some learning objectives for a variety of reasons. And these reasons may include, but are not limited to, some disadvantages in regards to physical, behavioral, intellectual, emotional, and or social capacities. So in order to understand the collaborative technologies for children with special needs, we mainly posed 3 questions in our research. What are the types and aims of collaborative technologies developed for children with special needs? What are the special needs, ages, and gender of the children? And in what contexts are collaborative technologies have been developed? And what are the methodological approaches and theoretical groundings to evaluate collaborative technologies? For the systematic literature review, we used ACM Digital Library as the database, which contains a comprehensive archive for interdisciplinary HCI-related publications, including journals, magazines, and conference proceedings. And using these combination of keywords, having collaboration and cooperation as the primary terms in the metadata and related terms to child as secondary in the metadata or in the body text of the paper. We looked at all the papers beginning from 1992 to 2019. So the first search query resulted with 310 papers. Then as a second step, we eliminated the papers that do not directly involve children. For instance, if the students are university students or if the technology is not directly developed or designed for children's collaborative use. And this elimination resulted with 190 papers, which focus on children in general. And then as a final step, we eliminated papers which do not involve children with special needs, which we mean by children who deal with developmentally diverse conditions such as autism, Down syndrome, visual or hearing impairments, or a type of latency such as learning difficulties. Since these conditions of special needs are very much fragmented in the existing literature, this three-step of elimination not only helped us to capture the results for wide variety of special conditions in different studies, but also helped us to see the results from a broader perspective. So we found only 35 papers in total, which focused on children with a type of special need, and our final analysis included only these 35 papers. So our findings showed an increase of attention after 2006. From the 35 papers, 29 of them were published in the last 6 or 7 years. So this suggests that collaborative technologies for children with special needs is a rather new phenomenon in the HCI community that is increasingly gaining attention. So if you look at the distribution across different venues, as might be anticipated, Interaction Design and Children Conference, IDC Conference, and Computer Supported Cooperative Work, CSCW Conference are the most represented conferences among ACM publications on this topic, and CHI follows them and runs up as the third in the list. The collaborative technologies mostly include children between 6 to 12 years old, children as target group, and mostly males as participants have been involved in the studies. In terms of special needs condition, children with autism were the most studied ones when compared to other developmental conditions such as visual or hearing impairments and other chronic illnesses. So in this table, you can see an overview of the papers in terms of the special need conditions, which are listed on the left column here, if you can follow my cursor, and the context of the settings that the studies or the technology took place, as can be seen on top row. And in the intersecting cells on the table, the types of technologies are displayed, which you can find what the abbreviations refer to at the bottom. So in summary, most of the studies took place in school or classroom context when compared to other settings such as hospitals, therapeutic services, or home environments. And when it comes to types of technology, tangible and embodied tools were prominent types of technologies developed or tested for and with children with special needs. Mobile and online technologies follow them. Also, interestingly, robots are gaining some interest as collaborative agents for children with special needs. So besides these, in terms of the geographical distribution of the studies, we found that there is significantly more work done in Europe and North America than the rest of the world. So our study showed that we need more demographically diverse studies on collaborative technologies for children with special needs. But for us, one of the most striking, remarkable findings of the study was to see that there is a lack of concrete definition for the term collaboration. Finding a definition was actually one of our basic motivation in our research to find and adapt for measuring the collaborative aspects of the collocated collaborative games that we are currently developing for our project. But with this literature review, we found that collaboration mostly used interchangeably with cooperation, social interaction, or group work, which intermingles or sometimes even reduces the significance of the term. So, and in relation with this lack of concrete definition, of course, the set of evaluation criteria for collaboration is very much scattered in HCI research. In our paper, we present an extensive work on the methodological approaches to collaborative technologies and the set of evaluation criteria used in these studies. And these include the ones from adopting some existing frameworks that range from social interaction to gesture analysis, or a combination of self-determined evaluation criteria with existing frameworks that investigate the engagement, communication, or cooperative activities in relation to collaboration, and some few studies that describe their bottom-up approach to evaluate collaborative aspects of their tools without using any a priori or predefined criteria. So these examples for evaluating collaborative technologies can be found in very much in detail in our paper. So I will invite you to read our paper to find the further detailed information. But I would like to conclude presenting the main takeaways of our study, which we suggest as the future directions for this topic of research, that we need studies for instance, developing evaluation criteria to better understand and analyze collaboration and collaborative aspects of interaction mediated by collaborative technologies, developing solid theoretical frameworks and design tools on collaborative interaction. And we need definitely more demographically diverse studies to bring a more universal understanding of collaboration as a term, or special education as the context, or as the target group, and clarifying concepts and definitions in research reports to avoid confusion with other related terms such as group work, cooperation, or social skills, and explore those nuances with collaboration. So thank you for listening to me. Now I will stop sharing my slides, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks a lot for the presentation, and the chat is open for your questions. In the wait for that, I have prepared 1 or 2 questions myself. So the first question is something that you address in the very, very final part of your paper, is that the choice of the database, which was only ACM. And again, no reason is given. So I'm a bit surprised, especially if you look at the learning science or technology and learning community. It seems to be totally absent in your set, which I think would be a very relevant opportunity and community. So why did you limit it to the ACM? And I mean, a search of a database is not really the most time demanding one. And you already stated a few that you thought were good alternatives, but you didn't use them at the time.
Thank you for asking this question. We have been thinking about this ourselves too, but while starting our literature review, our first motivation to look at the existing, so ACE, very comprehensive and very like the ACM is all about the technologies, and we refer to valuable studies going on in other databases, which we address in our discussion. And the limitation of our literature review as well. And I hope this answered your question.
Thank you so much. There were unfortunately some technical issues in your answer, but I gather that you will just do the work in the next round. And there's one question that I found from the chat, and that is from Darius. Darius, you can unmute yourself and post it.
Darius, I cannot hear you.
There we go. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Fair enough. Yeah, thanks for the talk, Elif. It's very interesting work. I'm just curious because you have read a lot of papers now. You have a really good picture of the field. So did you get any kind of sense of idea of what kind of technology the children were more fond of or happy to engage in? Did you get any kind of feeling?
I think, I mean, it is a really difficult question to answer because as the diversity of these developmental conditions, as the needs, the favorites, the most interesting ones and more appropriate and applicable ones might vary. And I think exploring this variety from kind of a universal definition of collaboration, but exploring these diversities is the interesting part, might be the interesting part. And it might be always changing and in terms of how children actually favor these kind of technologies.
Okay, but in overall, was it a promising field to work in? Like these kind of evaluations they did it seem like it was something that worked?
I think it is very interesting topic, since the collaboration in itself offers a lot of room to investigate different aspects of the interaction between subjects, between the inter-subject and kind of technology kind of interaction. So it creates a lot of enrichment to investigate a lot of things around us.
Thanks.
I see one more question popping up in the chat, and it is by Nitin. Nitin, you have the floor.
Elif, I just wanted to bring up that while IDC has been having many workshops and papers in this area, it's very challenging to make a broad assessment of this area, because special needs, as we know, are so specialized, with autism to physical impairments to speech impairments. So when we talk about collaboration, we have to examine each of these special situations in a very specific way. So I just wanted to see how you were trying to think about this. Are you trying to draw yourself into a particular research area, or are you examining a very broad span of what teachers deal with in special needs contexts in classrooms, rather than very specific disability areas?
Mm. Well, in our project, we're currently working with a school, like public school, who have some special need classroom with children who have some delays for learning. But I mean, they're not severely diagnosed with any of these, but they have some ADHD. And I totally agree that all these different developmental conditions have their own particular and like their peculiar types of needs and requirements. And that's why, as a starting point, maybe the definition, clarifying a definition for collaboration might enable to explore all these diversities and all these requirements and diversity of requirements in a more standardized or like more systematic way, let's say. So we definitely need a kind of an initial starting point to define collaboration and then explore all those diversities in terms of technology, requirements, needs.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I see no new question popping up in the chat. So then I step in and pose another methodological question. You presented an overview of the geographical distribution of the research that you have found. And my question is, could that geographical distribution be related to the database that you chose to find the literature, especially since that it is quite English oriented in its publication? So I can think of, for example, results from studies in China being published in Chinese or some other language, which may have some effect on the geographical distribution, which you presented as a finding, but I didn't see any mention of that in the limitations part.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. In the methodology where we are describing that we are only, in the elimination part, we are only focusing on the English written papers, but perhaps in our discussion too, we had to pinpoint that because we didn't have any access to all those other language kind of research. But still, I think ACM is a well-represented, like internationally well-represented venue. So I think this finding is still kind of says for further investigation and further discussion, I guess. So, and the collaboration as a term, maybe the concept of collaboration might not be that much common in other parts of the world, or the special education as a context is not that much common in other parts of the world. So these two, we cannot really say something with our own literature review, but these two have to be, I think it's worth to think further about the geographical distribution on this topic.
Yes, but that those explanations could be valid, but I think for that you need to compare them to the general distribution of papers in the ACM database, and you see if the general distribution differs from the distribution that you found, and then you can have data. Now it is a concluded data point that is without context. So I would encourage you to put it into a context so we can see what the value of the data point is.
Yeah, thank you for the good point. Yeah.
And yes, the accessibility is another issue that was raised in the chat. So not all databases accessible everywhere, or not all conferences could be visited by people from anywhere. I mean, we see a high correlation between the counties that have funding to go to conferences and who then can do the research to present it at those conferences. So I think there's more to these distribution questions than we have seen so far. But an interesting issue for sure to pursue.
Yeah.
With that, I think we've come to the end of this session. I thank you all a lot, and especially the last presentation. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks also from the organizer side, both the presenters and Harko for chairing the session.